Testing times, conflicts and crises leave new questions hanging over the United Nations. With so much power in the hands of 5 member states, can it really help when it matters? From North Korean missiles to Myanmar's persecuted Rohingya, millions of people are looking to the United Nations for leadership. But is it willing to act? We'll have reports from Syria, Iraq and Bangladesh looking at the cost of inaction. I'm Rita Fakhri with a TRT World special asking if it is time for change at the UN. Hello and welcome from the United Nations headquarters here in New York, the setting for this week's high-level meetings and high-pressure speeches at this year's UN General Assembly. Now, while some of the leaders here talk tough on North Korea and Iran, millions of people around the world continue to suffer in humanitarian catastrophes from Myanmar to Syria to Yemen. And the UN and its all-important Security Council member state stands accused of watching on. Now, many would argue that things around here have to change. The UN is under pressure to show that it can represent the whole world, not just the 5 nations who wield so much of the political power. On this program, we'll put the UN under the spotlight and look at what comes next if it fails to adapt. Its future and the need to reform, a key talking point among many of the leaders here.
Tüm bu gelişmeler ve yaşanan insani trajediler Türkiye olarak dünya 5'ten büyüktür diyerek sembolleştirdiğimiz Birleşmiş Milletler Güvenlik Konseyi'nin yeniden yapılandırılması çağrımızın haklılığını teyit ediyor.
Excellencies, we need to reform our world, and I'm committing to reforming the United Nations. Together, we have embarked on a comprehensive reform effort to build a UN development system to support states in bettering people's lives, to reinforce our ability to safeguard people's peace, security, and human rights, and to embrace management practices that advance those goals instead of hindering them.
The success of the United Nations depends upon the independent strength of its members. To overcome the perils of the present and to achieve the promise of the future, we must begin with the wisdom of the past. Our success depends on a coalition of strong and independent nations that embrace their sovereignty to promote security, prosperity, and peace for themselves and for the world.
Now, supporters of the UN will tell you it is the best hope for resolving conflict. Its critics would say it needs to fix a major injustice of its own. John Brain has the Bigger Than 5 briefing.
Nearly 200 countries sharing a vision of equality and mutual respect in the cause of maintaining world peace. It would be hard to argue that the United Nations has come even close to fulfilling its lofty ideals. It certainly hasn't achieved peace around the globe. Barely a day has gone by since its creation when there wasn't a war somewhere in the world. For 6 years now, the UN has repeatedly tried and repeatedly failed to end the conflict in Syria. Critics say that's just one example of the organisation's failure.
I think the main problem with the United Nations is that in many cases it's simply toothless. It has a lot of bodies that are in charge with, for example, shedding light on climate change. But it doesn't have any enforcement power, really. It has a valedictory power, in a sense, over its members. It can encourage them to do things, but it can't, even under Chapter 7 resolutions in many cases, can't force them to do things.
But the UN has had some major successes, particularly in alleviating crises through its humanitarian efforts. And it offers perhaps the only viable forum for at least attempting to tackle major international issues. But many believe the organisation is hamstrung by a structure that gives the real power to a very select group of nations. There are 193 countries in the UN, but only 15 of them are on the all-important Security Council. 10 seats on that council are for non-permanent members who serve 2-year terms. The other 5 countries are permanent members: Russia, the United States, China, France and the UK, a privilege that goes back to the aftermath of the Second World War. These 5 have a veto. They can block any Security Council vote and regularly do. For example, Russia has used its veto 133 times, the US more than 80 times. And the veto has been a long-running source of grievance here, one that's often seen as undermining the very legitimacy of the United Nations. There are growing calls for it to be scrapped altogether. But without it, it's very unlikely the major powers of the time would ever have agreed to join an international body like the UN in the first place. A former UN ambassador says the veto was and remains a necessary bargain.
Hard to imagine how you undo that bargain in the current circumstance. So, eliminating the veto is everybody's sort of easy solution to how you fix the, quote, broken UN. But the fundamental problem is not the veto. The problem is how do you facilitate, create a consensus among the key members about what the problem is and what the solution is.
What is clear is that the pressure for change at the UN is likely to continue to grow. John Brain, TRT World, New York.
Now, the latest crisis to create alarm here at the UN and around the world is in Myanmar. More than 400,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled a brutal crackdown by the military. Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi, meanwhile, has stayed away from the UN and has again rejected accusations of ethnic cleansing. That charge was leveled by the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein. He gave us his reaction to Suu Kyi's speech when we spoke to him a little earlier.
Well, it was interesting. She made it in English, and she didn't speak in Burmese. That was one sort of thing that caught our eye. The second point was that while she made some positive comments about condemning violence and opening up her country to scrutiny, saying essentially they have nothing to hide, unless this is accompanied by actions now where they open up the country to my team, for instance, my office, which I have in Cox's Bazar, these remarks will seem insincere.
Do you have a single UN investigator?
No, we have a team in Cox's Bazar along the border in Bangladesh. They could be ready to move in today if there is sincerity behind what she says. The other point is that yes, it's right to condemn violence in general, but this has all the hallmarks of a campaign, a systematic campaign, and I would have wanted her to address that more directly.
And this is a military campaign, as you say, that's been going on and that's been well orchestrated.
That's right.
For quite a while.
That's right.
Close to 500,000 people.
That's right.
To Bangladesh, if we take the 80,000 who've crossed over last year and the 400,000 according to the latest numbers by the UN. Yet, your boss, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, is hopeful that the situation could be reversed. Can it be reversed?
Well, it can be reversed if all those who were flushed out are invited back in. We worry that these vetting procedures that she spoke of will limit re-entry into Rakhine State to a small number, which will only confirm to us that this was indeed a policy of ethnic cleansing being implemented.
You say she has not allowed access to investigators, that she may do so now. You have called it still a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, the first UN official to do so. What evidence do you have to back up those strong accusations and to back up this term that you've used? Because she keeps saying that this is all fake news.
No, I mean, we had satellite imagery available to us and prominent NGOs as well. We could see the numbers, the scale was quite remarkable. And if this was a counterinsurgency, you wouldn't see numbers like this flee. I sent a team days ago to Cox's Bazar, and they have been reporting to us daily on the basis of the interviews they've conducted. And it's quite clear this is a campaign that has been put together by the military. Of course, to establish crimes against humanity, for instance, or ethnic cleansing, eventually has to be done by a judicial body, and the evidence must be collected. But it has all the hallmarks of an ethnic cleansing campaign.
And you yourself have seen ethnic cleansing up close when you served in the former Yugoslavia.
Yes.
Clearly the UN, though, has been silent, has failed the Rohingya people for several decades. It's not spoken out about their plight. Now the Security Council got involved the other day, but in a very meek sort of way. What needs to be done at the Security Council level?
Yes, I'm glad you raised this. They came out with a press statement, and it was seen to be something that after 9 years there was at least one voice being expressed by the Security Council. Frankly speaking, a press statement is not good enough. We need a resolution. It should clearly articulate what is required: a stop to the killing, a return of all refugees, and then, in my opinion, there should be penalties if there is if they don't abide by the terms.
I mean,
there could be. I mean,
very well entrenched, vested economic interests.
Well, it's ultimately up to the Security Council to decide this. But I think it merits, given the size and scale of what we see and the dangers of this enveloping the entire region, that measures should be taken in case of non-compliance, should a resolution be adopted. But the Council needs to think along those lines.
Are you hopeful that the Council might still act?
I think if we continue to highlight the deep suffering of the people, the Rohingya, one hopes that they will understand that the dynamics are not a good dynamic.
But some human rights activists say that perhaps this needs to be labeled and classified as genocide, and that perhaps would put more of a burden on the Security Council to act.
I mean,
are we there yet?
Well, the evidence basically will decide on where we move in terms of how we describe the international crime that we believe could be committed. When I hear from my own colleagues in Cox's Bazar, and I have to differentiate between my own colleagues who are there and the fact-finding mission that the Human Rights Council has put together. But if we begin to hear that this is what our colleagues begin to feel, we would say so. But at the moment, we're not there yet.
Just finally, High Commissioner, you've been criticised by some, obviously the powerful members of the Security Council, for being possibly too vocal. Meanwhile, the Secretary General of the UN is criticised by many for being too silent. Who's got it right?
Oh, it's an impossible question for me to answer. I'm merely doing my job along with my colleagues who report to us from the field, and we will articulate what we believe the world needs to know in defense of the rights of victims.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, the situation in Myanmar isn't the only one, of course, that the UN is accused of mishandling. In a moment, we'll hear from Alishan Ayanlar in Syria, Nicole Johnston, who is in northern Iraq. But first, we can hear from Shamim Chowdhury in Bangladesh for more on the unfolding Rohingya crisis there.
Tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees have been arriving every day for the past few weeks, escaping the violence in Myanmar. The UN has already described it as a textbook case of ethnic cleansing, and the UN Secretary General has written to the Security Council appealing for an end to the violence. But in this case, it would seem that most likely this is all the UN can do on this matter. And that is because China has already made it clear that it supports Myanmar's security forces in its actions. Added to this, Myanmar has only recently been brought back into the international fold after years of isolation, and as such, it has many new friends around the world.
Nearly 500,000 people killed, 6 million internally displaced, and more than 5 million refugees outside the country. It was at last year's General Assembly at the United Nations where outgoing Secretary General Ban Ki-moon accused all heads of state of ignoring, participating, and in some cases even carrying out the atrocities against the people of Syria. The UN's Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, has described the situation as the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. Daesh may now be on its heels in Syria, but as the war nears the 7-year mark, the humanitarian situation in rebel-held areas is dire. The Astana talks with Russia, Iran, and Turkey as guarantors have been able to set up a framework for a shaky ceasefire with the establishment of de-escalation zones throughout the country. But the real challenge in finding a lasting solution will be to get all of the Syrian parties at the same table to negotiate an end to the fighting and find a political solution.
The chaos in Iraq highlights the failure of the international system and the United Nations. In 2003, the UN refused to sanction the invasion of Iraq. The UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, later said that it was illegal. But Washington said it was an act of self-defense under the UN Charter, and it went ahead with it. It also said there were weapons of mass destruction. It later turned out there weren't any. After the invasion, though, the US needed the UN's help, but it wanted to minimize its role here. The US went ahead with an interim government and a de-Baathification law. That led to an insurgency in Iraq and many years later to the creation of Daesh. 6 years ago, the United States withdrew its troops. Recently, it sent a number of them back here in the war against Daesh. The United Nations has been here the whole time, trying to pick up the pieces and help more than 3 million internally displaced Iraqis.
Now, one person who knows all too well the inner workings of the UN and its failures is Dennis Halliday, a former Assistant Secretary General. He served as UN humanitarian coordinator in Iraq in the late 1990s. I spoke to him earlier about the need for reform. We've been hearing about UN reform for the last decade or more, as you know. Many people talk about reform, the need to change things at the United Nations, but as long as you have most of the power controlled by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, is there any point in talking about reform?
In my view, reform has got to start at the top. Other forms of reform can come later throughout the system, whatever it is, but the top is the Security Council, not the Secretary General. The Security Council, dominated, as you suggest, by the 5 permanent members who have veto power.
But so how do you create that change? I mean, do you make the P5 give up their veto power? Is that even something that is feasible?
Well, I think we'd have to talk to the General Assembly, we'd have to talk to the non-aligned movement and explain that they need representation. And this management of permanent seats was created by the 5 powers themselves. It's self-appointed. It's nonsense. It has to be changed.
And how would you change it? What would be the secret to the best kind of reform that we could see at the Council?
Well, I believe we have to have, as I said, non-aligned movement representation in the Council. We need North-South representation. So what we could do is break it up into regional groups. So, for example, North America would have 1 seat. Canada, United States and Mexico, and one of them would sit on that seat. Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa would have 1 seat. It could be Nigeria, it could be Swaziland, who knows? And they would represent their group and their region. Same for South Asia, same for Middle East and North Africa. In other words, the whole world would have a voice in the Council which represents and talks about peace and goodwill and all the things we attach importance to.
And you worked for the UN for many years. Could you see this happening? Could you see the P5 sharing power with newcomers, with the likes of India, with a representative from the Muslim world, from the Sub-Saharan African world, from Latin America? Could you actually see this happen?
Well, I believe in majority rule, and I think if we have any democracy at all, it resides in the General Assembly. And I believe the vast majority of the member states in the General Assembly would endorse change and reform and sharing the burden of permanent seating. And you would get very different decisions. I mean, as you know, I worked in Iraq. I saw what the Security Council did to Iraq. The United Nations Security Council, member states, 5 permanent member states, we killed 500,000, maybe 1 million people, most of whom were children.
And what do you make of the criticism that's often leveled at the P5 countries, as we know, when it comes to their human rights record around the world? Is that fair criticism, that they're the ones, they're the countries where the power resides to act on peace and security, to uphold human rights, in other words, around the world, yet are they the best place to do so?
No, I don't think so. They are the neo-colonial regimes. They are the most dangerous people on earth. They're the ones who pursue military aggression, every one of the 5 without exception. I mean, they're the ones who, I think, have corrupted the Security Council, corrupted the UN Charter, and it needs to be changed. And if we have the countries that manufacture and sell weapons, the arms dealers in charge of peace, there's obviously something wrong with that, that model. We need to get the world in charge of peace, along with the big powers, of course, as well.
How hopeful are you that things can change at the UN in a way that would keep the organization relevant, that it would restore its authority, make it more credible, more representative in the world for someone who has worked for so long within the organization? Are you hopeful at all? And what would you consider to be the UN's biggest failure?
Well, we have failed in Iraq, we've failed Libya, we've failed Syria. Where haven't we failed, you might say? Our peacekeeping is perhaps the best thing we do, and that we must continue and expand and have a more aggressive role, perhaps. But we do need to see, I think, the permanent 5 changing their position, not pursuing vested interests, not selling weapons where they shouldn't be sold. You know, everybody understands defense. You sell weapons to the Saudis who are destroying Yemen and people are dying as we speak. That's clearly not compatible with membership of the Council or the UN Charter or international law generally. So we've got to just change the mindset of the member states to come and work with each other, big or small, doesn't matter. Try democracy, at least try North-South representation. and get decisions where we don't persecute the weak and the poor and the countries that we don't like and the dictators we don't want. That's not our business. That's a bigger issue. It's not to be controlled by Washington or London or Berlin or, not Berlin, sorry, Moscow or Beijing or Paris.
Dennis Holliday, thanks very much. The cost of doing nothing or not doing enough has been made clear in some dark period since the UN was created. Time and again, it has been accused of failing to act while disasters play out.
The Rwandan genocide of 1994 saw 800,000 people killed in just 100 days. UN peacekeepers already on the ground sent warnings to the Security Council, but no action was taken. In 2003, Sudan was mired in conflict. After a series of defeats, the military began using a militia group, the Janjaweed, to attack minorities in Darfur. It would be 3 years until a small unit of UN forces were sent in. By 2010, 300,000 people were dead. In power from 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge executed one of the largest genocides of the 20th century. More than 2 million Cambodians were murdered before the regime was ousted. But Cold War politics denied the victims justice, with the UN refusing to recognize the new government. In July 1995, more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim boys and men were slaughtered by Bosnian Serb forces, while United Nations peacekeeping forces looked on. Around 700 Dutch soldiers were in the area. They would be witnesses to the biggest war crime in Europe since the Second World War. The Palestinian-Israeli question is one of the UN's longest unsolved problems. A UN resolution from 1967 sets out the land entitled to the Palestinians, but after 50 years of occupation, the struggle goes on.
So how can the UN reform? Well, there are a number of different ideas being put forward for an overhaul of the UN. One is to scrap permanent membership on the Security Council and the veto power, no more Big Five. Another is to make the Security Council bigger, possibly with 20 or more countries. A 2/3 vote would be needed in the General Assembly before the Security Council could agree to sanctions or take any military action. And nations could appeal to an international court against decision made by the Council. So lots to talk about with our guests. Akshaya Kumar is Deputy UN Director at Human Rights Watch, and Reza Afshar is Policy Director at the Independent Diplomat, a think tank here in New York. Thank you both for joining us. Akshaya, obviously everyone knows the major problem with the UN is the fact that the organization is often held hostage by the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. We've seen the competing interests leading quite often to paralysis within the Council. Just look at the case of Syria, with the war in its 6th, 7th year since 2011, close to 500,000 people dying there, no movement at the Security Council. The situation in Yemen, another classic example of Security Council inaction with statements of grave concern at best. And of course, we know the situation in Myanmar as well. How do we make sure that this organization lives up to the ideals of people across the world and lives up to the 3 words within the Charter, we the peoples?
Well, you pointed to exactly the problem that we struggle with every day, which is that too many permanent members are willing to politicize these issues when they really should be putting prevention and ending mass atrocities at the forefront. One of the ways that we've tackled that is by going around the Security Council. In the case of Syria, last year, we appealed to the entire General Assembly. We said, look, the Security Council can't agree to act in the interest of justice for Syria's victims. Will you, 193 members of the General Assembly, take action? And they did. In December, they set up a special mechanism to investigate the crimes that have been committed in Syria. Maybe it's time to look at the same option for Myanmar, where we expect that there will be almost 500,000 people pushed from their homes by the government's campaign of ethnic cleansing.
If you count the 80,000 who've crossed over since last year and the close to 400,000 Rohingya people, yes, I mean, we can expect 500,000 easily. What would you like to see done differently within the Security Council when it comes to the situation in Myanmar, Reza? And is the Security Council often focusing on the wrong issues, would you think?
I think the Security Council has an opportunity now to demonstrate that it will take this situation seriously. And I do think that I understand what Akshay is saying, but ultimately dealing with crises decisively does require the Security Council. It's the system that we have. It may not be perfect, so it does need to work. But when you've got the 5 major powers with vested interest in each of these so when you talk about failure,
countries,
when you talk,
definitely in Myanmar, how do you expect them to act?
When you talk about the failure of the UN or the failure of the Security Council, you're really talking about the failure of member states. And in order to move these issues forward, member states have to decide to apply leverage and actually decide that they're going to exert the political will to make something happen in the council.
But it's not all member states, of course.
Yes,
and
the P5 are key in that. And the P5, members of the P5 do have the ability, for example, to exert leverage over Russia or leverage over China if they choose to use it. So Myanmar is a good example where leverage needs to be brought to the table to test the Chinese, to see if something can be done to demonstrate to the government of Myanmar that its actions are unacceptable.
And instead, we have a lot of focus, Akshaya, on other issues. You yourself mentioned at the top that the issues are often way too politicized. I mean, we hear Donald Trump come to the UN and talk about North Korea and ratchet up the pressure there, and Iran. But does that really reflect how the rest of the membership of the UN wants to see the organization focusing?
Well, I think many people are rightly concerned about the non-proliferation threat presented by North Korea, but there have been, almost uncountable numbers of meetings on that issue. And what's shocking is that in contrast, on a situation like Myanmar with the Rohingya, we haven't had a single open public session of the UN Security Council to discuss this issue. And I agree with Reza that it's time to really put the Chinese on the spot. One of the easiest things the Council could do would be to throw open its doors and let the world see what the Chinese are actually saying. What are they objecting to? And would they really be willing to use their veto on an issue this dire? Are they willing to take that step? I hope they're not.
Reza, how crucial is it for the UN Security Council to operate in a more transparent way? Akshaya talks about the needs for open sessions. We know that all the meetings that have taken place on Myanmar, for example, have been behind closed doors. And we look at the way the Security Council has focused in its resolutions so far this year. There's been close to 40 resolutions issued. Almost half of them have dealt with countries with majority Muslim people in them, and the other half almost has been focused on Africa. Do we have the right balance?
So I think there's two issues around transparency. The first is that it is important sometimes to make sure that, as we've discussed, to expose some of the arguments that are out there in a public session. But public sessions are also choreographed. So sometimes you do need that private session in order to exert leverage, in order to do deals, and in order to break the deadlock. But the second thing about transparency is the Security Council would do much better if it was forced to have to listen to the people who are most affected by conflict. So actually engaging them directly will lead you to better solutions.
So how do you achieve that? How do you engage people directly?
One of the things that we've seen recently is a council that has on occasion invited activists and civil society speakers to brief them directly. So in May, we had a Yemeni woman come before the council and speak about how difficult it is to live in Yemen today with the unending Saudi bombardment, with the Houthi Saleh forces shelling neighborhoods, with schools and hospitals being attacked. And hearing directly from a person who's affected by the conflict like that happens just all too rarely in these hallowed halls. You have diplomats, you have heads of states. You don't often hear from the most marginalized or affected people.
In a nutshell, finally, final thoughts on this. What would you like to see happen? How hopeful are you about the future of the UN unless drastic change takes place?
I'm actually an optimist on this. I think that the Security Council can work, but it's up to member states to bring the leverage to the table. It has happened in the past, it's happened on plenty of conflicts in the past, it is possible, but the political will needs to be there. I think we're going through a bad patch at the moment in terms of people's willingness to bring that to the table, and I would like to see that change.
From my side, I think the UN has great potential. Right now, it's been cornered in many ways by the US administration's hostile rhetoric and threats of pulling out funding. And it's not just the US. The Saudis have also threatened to use financial leverage to get their way. For the UN to retain its promise as being a voice for the people, it needs to speak unequivocally and independently, regardless of these financial pushes.
Akshaya Kumar, Reza Afshar, thanks very much for joining us.